Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting of the Bellingham City Council's Public Works, Public Safety to order. We have 5 items before us today. And the first item is an update on fire equipment purchase. Chief,
Good morning.
take it
Thank
away.
you. I wanted to share with you some information regarding 2 equipment purchases coming up in the near future. This is an information update on the heels of a January meeting in which we presented to you our intent to purchase 6 BLS ambulances. At that meeting, we had indicated we were going to apply to the Washington State Local Option Capital Asset Lending Program. We've done that. We've received approval, and in the near future, we want to bring forward to you an ordinance to be able to enter into accept that and then take acquisition of the 6 BLS aid cars. The second item is I'd like to share with you the conclusion of our research with regard to the fireboat. This falls under the port security grant that we were awarded by the federal government last year. And in that January meeting, we provided you an overview of the research that we had been doing to look at capabilities and various manufacturers for the fireboat. That research has been concluded, and we've now been working closely with one manufacturer, that's Moose Boats, and we're now working with our finance and legal department on purchasing and putting together a contract. That has not been finalized, but we're nearing the end stages of that and anticipate being able to bring that forward to you in the very near future.
Jack and then Michael.
So, Bill, was the contract to this company, was that done through an RFQ or RFP?
Which one are you referring to?
The boats.
The boat. What we've done is we've set some parameters that are, one, stipulated underneath the port security grant, which is a 2-year performance period. And then so through due diligence, one of the things that we wanted to work off of was the GSA schedule, Government Servicing Administration. And that provides us an opportunity to work expeditiously. And so we looked at several manufacturers that are listed on the GSA website and through their process, and then acquiring information, selected one of those. It was not a bid process as far as put out as far as an RFQ from multiple different bidders.
You were just working off the federal list.
That's correct. And in conjunction with our purchasing department, shows indication of being able to do that as a transparent process.
Okay.
Thank you.
Michael?
I guess I am wondering why we went with this federal GSA schedule rather than, I know there are several local boat builders, and this isn't, I don't want to, this is very technical, but it's also not rocket science in the sense that there are probably a handful of boat builders in Whatcom or Skagit or Island counties who could have done this work.
Yes.
But it sounds like we really didn't do that. We went to a federal list and found Moose Boats on that list.
So good question. So in our research, we actually talked with a number of our local builders. Some are not currently building vessels that fit our particular needs, and they were very clear with us on that. There were others that may have had an interest but are currently not on GSA, and they directly indicated to us that could take them some time to get up on GSA. One of our reasons for selecting GSA is talking with our colleagues in the fire service, some who have recently taken delivery of some fireboats, say within the last 3 or 4 years. They've been really challenged to meet the 2-year performance period of the grant. And it's been their experience and suggestion, based on events that have taken place, to go with GSA. Part of the reason is the federal government has been really more constrained in sticking to that 2-year performance period. In the past, it was not uncommon that it was pretty much automatic for an extension beyond the 2-year performance period.
So to clarify, when you say a 2-year performance period, you mean that's how long it would take them to build and deliver the boat?
The 2-year performance period is in the grant from the day that we received it to the day that we have to have complete funding or complete performance of it as far as taking delivery and put into service whatever it is that we were purchasing.
So your
that
concern is
two-year
that-
period is set.
You're
And
concerned that a non-GSA listed boat builder might not be able to deliver within the 2 years?
That is correct, and that has been demonstrated in several different instances. And so the risk to us was, one, we spoke with many of our local manufacturers. We were very upfront with this requirement. And I think at this time, to speculate on the ability to acquire that boat within the 2-year time frame as we go, if we were to go through that bid process, I don't think was in our best interest.
Okay, I guess I would have hoped that we could have used a local boat builder and maybe had it delivered, or had a boat that was adequate to our needs and the port's needs, for a lesser price. That's what I guess I would have liked to have seen. Did local boat builders feel they could deliver within the 2-year period, but you just had your doubts anyway and took a safer route? Is that an accurate depiction?
I'd want to check back with our research team on specifically which manufacturers stated they could or could not build within that time frame. But all of the indications were, in summary, is that no, there was no confirmation that a boat could be built to our specifications within that time frame.
Second question. I want to switch then, Chief, to the 6 aid cars. You said they were BLS aid cars.
That's correct.
Now, so one's basic life support, one's advanced life support, our Medic One. How do you differentiate the aid cars? Does like a BLS aid car not go out on an ALS call?
So this go around, what we're looking at with these BLS aid cars is they're a smaller box, if you will, the big box that's on the back. Predominantly the type of work that you would do in the back of a BLS aid car versus an ALS if you had trauma, cardiac arrest, et cetera. A little bit more working room in our ALS ambulances. Currently, what we're driving around on the BLS were older ALS. But in going forward with this purchase, we found efficiencies through making the box a little bit smaller. That gave us some savings. And then also some of the configuration is different, drug boxes, et cetera, of what you have internally in the vehicle.
Okay, I guess I'm confused because I thought that, when you dispatched an aid car, you didn't always know. You had the dispatcher thought there was maybe an ALS or a BLS call, but of course you may get out there and ALS call isn't so severe as a BLS call, and vice versa. You go, do you think my BLS call in terms of an ALS call? I don't know. I just assumed that all the cars were ALS and that the call level was determined once you got there, not ahead of time.
So just a little information on that. The call taker actually triages that call and is able to determine BLS or ALS. If it's an ALS call, you have the paramedics that respond in their ALS unit along with firefighters and an engine company. If it is strictly a BLS call, which is non-cardiac or significant trauma, then they will respond in the BLS unit, anticipating that lower level of care as far as severity of.
And no fire engine accompanies the BLS?
Typically, on a BLS call, they're going to take a BLS aid car so that they can transport. The only time that you would get a fire engine is if that company happened to be responding from a previous call and that was the vehicle that they were currently in before they returned to the station.
Okay, thank you for enlightening me.
Anything else? Well, thank you, Chief. So our next item is regards a temporary street closure and opening for McLeod Road culvert replacement.
Thank you, Ted Carlson, Public Works Department. First item, I'm going to throw a map up here to show you the location of this temporary street closure. Larry Skolton is the project engineer on here, and he can on this project, and he can answer any questions about the project. Essentially, this is a culvert rehabilitation to make the existing culvert not only repair it but also make it fish passable. And to do that, it requires a full closure of McLeod. We just simply don't have the room there to replace the culvert and keep traffic open. So I will put up a map here.
What?
Maybe not. It doesn't seem to be working. There was a map in the included in your packet. Essentially, this section of McLeod does not connect through from Telegraph over to James Street. There is a closure of the street. You could see where it used to connect through. It's been closed with a temporary barrier, so to speak, a combination of like a Type 3 barricade and ecology blocks, I believe. Actually, no guardrail. And what we're proposing is to remove that temporary closure just during the duration of the project itself. In terms of the impact to the folks off of on McLeod, very little additional traffic. Essentially what would be allowed is folks that were trying to access the public storage facility on McLeod would be able to access that facility off of James Street because they'll no longer have access off of Telegraph. So in terms of the additional traffic on the folks living on McLeod, it would just be people going to that public storage. We would keep that temporary closure open until the project was finished, and then we would replace the closure as it was previously.
So what's the purpose of having the road closed off in the first place?
It's a good question. We've done a little bit of research on that to try to figure out the origins of it. Oh, there's the map. So as you can see, McLeod, it's a little bit challenging to see on the map here, but right here, there's a temporary closure. Is that where it's at, Larry?
No, to the right, the black circle.
Oh, right there. We'll remove that just during construction. The origins of the closure, the best we could tell, was it was folks living on McLeod that were concerned about cut-through traffic coming from the commercial area through McLeod over to James. Essentially was a neighborhood-driven closure as far as we can tell. There's no restrictions that we're aware of that would prohibit us from opening it up, especially during a temporary nature for construction and then reclosing it. So there was nothing that we're aware of, like a hearing examiner determination associated with any land use. It was simply a council decision at the time to close it.
Because it seems like it kind of goes against our grid pattern goals, and if it was an issue of cut through, you could simply put traffic calming devices in.
Yeah, I mean, simply from a traffic connectivity perspective, you're absolutely right. That connection makes some sense. So we're actually looking a little bit more into the history, trying to better understand why the closure was put in the first place. But from folks that recall it happening, it was driven by neighborhood concerns over cut-through traffic. It wasn't a transportation-related closure.
So follow up on that, it seems to me that one good step might be to resurvey the residents in the area and see if they still feel like they would like the barrier installed. If opinions have changed, maybe we don't have to put it back in place. So in a certain sense, I don't really care what the history was. If this was a neighborhood-driven concern, it should probably still be, the neighborhood should be consulted.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We're anticipating we'll have some good discussions with property owners during the closure, and imagine we'll get feedback as to whether or not they would like to see the temporary closure go back or remain open, but we will do that. We'll make contact with people. Like with all these closures, and we have the next item is also related to a street closure. We'll have an outreach protocol where we work with the property owners, both letting them know about the project and the reasons for the closure, but that's a good question that we can ask the property owners.
So what's the source of funding for this particular project?
It's a good question. It's obviously coming out of the city's stormwater ecology grant on this one. No, this is entirely funded by local money, so city stormwater utility paying for this.
Okay. But nothing for fish passage grants or anything?
No grants on this one.
Okay. Move to approve.
Okay, all those in favor, recommending approval, right?
Aye.
Okay, we'll recommend approval to full council tonight. We'll recommend approval to the full council tonight.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, the next item is a temporary street closure for Chestnut Bay at Railroad Crossing for bridge rehabilitation.
Thank you. As I mentioned, another street closure. This is a project that we added to the 6-year TIP a couple of years ago in response to some funding that we had received through the state, through their BRAC program, their bridge funding. This is a bridge that has been posted with a weight restriction for some time, which has proven very challenging as it is a portion of the city's truck route that takes folks from the industrial portion of the waterfront ultimately over to the Squalicum Parkway, which is the truck route. This rehabilitation project will remove the need for weight restriction, but it will require a full closure. Larry Skolton is the project engineer on this project as well. And through the design, there was several alternatives that were considered, both in alternatives that would allow traffic to remain on the bridge, so partial closure, maybe doing a portion of the bridge, half the bridge, in some way to allow traffic to continue to flow. Very challenging, both from the logistics, the width there, but also from a safety perspective. This is a bridge that is being rehabilitated because it needed work to accommodate additional weight loads. We don't want to have too much traffic on there. Closing it during construction, the full closure will save some money, save approximately $600,000, and more importantly, I think, or just as important, will reduce the duration of the closure by about 4 months. So what we're requesting is a full closure for a period of approximately 6 months. Once we get the contractor on board, we'll certainly better understand the schedule. The map that I put up here is a little bit challenging to see, but it does have the detour on there as well. A little bit of a challenging detour you can see with the blue arrows and red arrows, but essentially if you're headed, we'll call it eastbound on Roeder, you can either go at F Street or Central over to Holly, and then Holly to, what is that? Can't even read my own map. Champion, and then through downtown back over. It's a detour that the heavy trucks have been doing all along. Now would be a detour that all traveling public would need to follow. So we will certainly work with our contractor to keep this closure as short in duration as possible, but we really don't see a good way around a full closure. And ultimately, this is a very good project to remove the weight restriction from the truck route. So we are requesting full closure.
Mike?
The description says new pavement and expansion joints. My memory is that it's more than new pavement. I think there's supposed to be actual reinforcing in the new surface. This isn't just putting pretty stuff back on top. We're actually strengthening the structure. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I'll turn it over to Larry for that.
Sure. Yep. They're going to expose the top layer of rebar through hydro milling, so they'll lower the deck. Scrape off the top section of deck, expose that top layer of steel reinforcing, examine it, look at it, repair it where necessary, and then they're also going to put some seismic restraints in so that we don't have some of the issues develop that are currently causing the expansion joints to move around. And then they'll pour concrete back in there, thin layer concrete.
I really appreciate the fact that you have to close this. There's no shoulder. I mean, you're up in the air. You can't make cars go around. They'd have to fly. So I'm going to move that we recommend approval tonight.
Jack?
Just a follow-up question. Do you know approximately what the thickness is of what's going to be removed?
It's like an inch and a half to get down to the rebar, I think, and then we're putting a little bit more back. There's some drainage issues out there, so I think they're going to adjust that in the field. But that's part of the reason, the safety issues, that we are exposing that steel. I think we're going to be putting some restrictions on the contractor as well, let alone having traffic on the bridge.
Thank you.
Okay, all those in favor of recommending approval, answer aye.
Aye.
Okay, we'll recommend approval tonight. The next item is a resolution to maintain adequate revenue streams for operating expenses and debt repayment of public trust fund loan.
Thank you. This is part of looking at financing options for Cornwall Avenue landfill and how we'll pay for the remediation at that site. One of the eligible funding sources is Public Works Trust Fund loan. The Public Works Board has a call for loans out right now. These would be 2016 loans. We would like to submit for $4 million for a loan that would help pay for that actual landfill cleanup. What this resolution does is says that the city will guarantee that we'll have money available to pay that debt. This money would come out of the solid waste fund. We've looked at it. We believe we have adequate cash flow to make the repayments. The Public Works Trust Fund loan continues to be a good source of financing, lower interest rates, favorable terms. So we would like to put an application in. Those applications are due mid-May. And again, this would be for 2016 construction loans.
Committee, Jack?
Do you know approximately how much this project's going to ultimately cost? Because it looks like you're just kind of ballparking what the loan component would be, and then we just match it with local money.
Well, this number, Amy came up with this number, Amy Cram, working with the consultants, and we believe with this $4 million, we would have the money to pay for the project. Also, we have to consider we have Department of Ecology, MOTCA money. There is no loan match requirement for the Public Works Trust Fund loan. So what we can do is we can leverage the MOTCA money. We have the ability to get up to $4 million if we're successful at this amount for the trust fund loan. So total project cost, I think, is a bit of a moving target. But when Amy looked at it, given what information she has now through the consultant and where we're at with the investigation between the MOTCA money and this, we believe we could fund the project.
Do you have an interest of doing that with R.G. Haley as well to piggyback this?
R.G. Haley, one of the challenges with this particular source of funding is the trust fund is only eligible for solid waste projects. So there's limitations on what you can use the trust fund money for. It has to be utility work, water, sewer, storm, transportation, or solid waste. I actually think that will be seen as a fairly favorable application because they don't do a lot of solid waste projects, but it is an eligible use of trust fund money. So I think our odds are pretty good in getting the money. It's a fairly small loan cycle, $175 million. This was the Public Works Assistance Account was the fund that was swept to help pay for the McCleary decision in education. So about $700 million was taken out of that fund. But they do have a call coming in 16. So we couldn't include R.G. Haley because it's not an eligible solid waste cleanup. We made that change with our solid waste utility tax to allow for cleanup of all remediation projects, but not an eligible use for trust fund money.
Mike?
With regard to the solid waste utility or tax fund, this says that we believe we can pay $257,000 per year. What is the annual revenue to that, and what is the current balance? And then third, what other things are committed or drawing off of that fund? I just want to understand the health of that fund.
Sure. Brings in a little over $1 million a year, if my memory serves. It is split between operating costs and remediation. So historically, we've been putting about $500,000 a year into remediation type projects. We paid for the Eldridge landfill cleanup out of that money. The operation costs go to fund Clean Green, a couple positions in the city, a litter patrol that's actually in the police department, pays for some code enforcement, things like that. Those are the operating components of the utility tax. The $500,000 we've been setting aside. In fact, I think recently we transferred it into a remediation fund. Is that correct, Brian? Yeah. So kind of getting ourselves geared up for all of the cleanup activities that we know are coming down the line on the waterfront. So when we look at that, we have about $500,000 a year. If we keep our current model moving forward, that would be eligible to either pay for engineering or cleanup associated with remediation projects, or in this case, pay the debt service. When we looked at this, we realized that when you look at all of the cleanup in the waterfront, our ability to cash flow it and pay as we go, it's going to be very challenging. We anticipated we would need outside funding. Given that, the trust fund is a favorable financing source of financing given the low interest rates.
Michael?
So a follow-up again on the solid waste utility tax. By the way, I think this is a very good application to make. So we're supporting it, but going back to the solid waste tax fund, you say it brings in about $1 million a year, or more or less. Would that revenue stream be affected by, we're coming up to renegotiate our solid waste contract with SSC in a year or two? Does this tax stream depend on that contract, or doesn't really depend on that contract?
It's 11.5% on total revenue generated within the city, solid waste recycling revenue in the city. So the rates, it is dependent on the solid waste rates. So the residential, commercial, whatever the solid waste activity is, obviously our contract with sanitary services residential only, but even their commercial activity within the city, revenue within the city, is subject to the 11.5% utility tax. So it's dependent on the rates. As the rates escalate, the fund gets a little bit more money in terms of utility tax. You had asked about the balance, and off the top of my head, I think the balance, there's some money in there that's basically obligated. We keep the 5% operating, that's the reserve, and so there's not a lot more than that in terms of revenue reserve. Brian's going to come up here and ask me to stop talking.
I guess we're in a peculiar position because I would it'd be nice if people's utility, solid waste bills went down. I mean, that would be good for them, and I'd hope it would happen, or at least stay low. But that means that the revenue on that fund stays low, and I just want to make sure that we don't want to plan for it to go up, because that may not be a good thing for our utility tax to go up, because that means everyone's bills are going up.
Okay, Brian Henshaw, Finance Department. I'll just add a couple things. So there's also outstanding bonds in the solid waste fund. So we have debt service that it's paying, and the remediation, this is one opportunity for good, low costing money. So we wanted to take the opportunity to apply for that. It's not a guarantee. It's not going to do all of the remediation down on the waterfront. It's only one portion of it. So you mentioned R.G. Haley. That's another whole project. But R.G. Haley isn't far enough along for us to, we can't use this money for solid waste, but we need to figure out a way to fund all of the cleanup down there. And this is only one piece of that pie. So when we did the remediation and the funding mechanism, we said we were going to look for other funding. This is one of them. It's not going to take care of it. There's other needs down there. We need to have another conversation about the solid waste fund and the cash flow that it's generating, but also the existing debt. So when we're further along in the RIFSs and we know when the construction's going to come, then we're going to have a way to pay for it. Another way would be a new bond for the solid waste, or to use the money that we were going to prepay those bonds back on. So we have over $5 million sitting in the solid waste fund right now, but it was going to be to refund the bonds in 2016. So all of these are options, and it kind of depends on the timing of the projects. And so as soon as we know when the remediation is going to happen, and it's a real schedule, and then we are going out to bid, then we're going to have to determine how we're going to pay for that. So one might be a bond, or one might be to just use that cash that we already have, depending on MOTCA and this loan. So there's a lot of unknowns that we're going to have to weigh as we get closer.
Thank you.
Jack?
Move to approve.
We have a motion to approve. All those in favor, answer aye.
Aye.
We will recommend approval tonight, which brings us to our last item today, the Waterfront Utility Master Plan District-Specific Utility Study.
Thank you. We were in front of the council earlier this year in February with a brief update on where we're at with the utility master planning process for the waterfront. We've had an opportunity to move forward with some work since then, and Freeman's going to provide a brief PowerPoint on where we're at, what we found, and next steps.
We're going to start the computer up first. So let's see here. These are copies of the PowerPoint. These will be made available to the other council members as well, as what you guys have.
This would have been nice to get advance.
It was not happening. So while we wait for this to power up here, we'll start off with some trivia, some acronym trivia.
Mike.
Freeman Anthony, Public Works Department. This morning's acronym trivia is BAU. What does BAU stand for? We're going to talk about it today, but
Best available something.
close. Getting there.
Utility is the U?
No? Terry? So it stands for business as usual, which is, all right, which is what, business as usual is what you might do in a standard development opportunity, but we know that the waterfront downtown, the waterfront is an opportunity to go beyond BAU. So that's really what we're going to talk about this morning is what the preliminary results are, basically the modeling of the utility master plan or the district-specific utilities, and how they're better than business as usual. However, also how the costs are related to going beyond business as usual. And so now, thank you very much, Linda. We'll go ahead and get started. District-specific utilities, the idea of putting in utilities above and beyond what we might normally see at in a typical developed area in Bellingham. It's a great opportunity. As the port moves ahead with their efforts, we've taken a look at what the district-specific utilities could look like. We'll share that with you today. I want to also let you know that there'll be a full report with lots of numbers and graphs and charts and things, and those will be made available to council this week in hard copy form and electronically. So the intent today is to give you just a high-level preview of the data, a little bit of the data on the front end, what the results were for the various district-specific utilities. The first bullet here is reasons why district-specific utilities are awesome, and I think most folks, in the discussions, you've seen the case made for district-specific utilities, realizing efficiencies, realizing existing assets on site. All this comes together with our presentation today of what we would call the triple bottom line approach to looking at each one of the options. So we'll look at the economics, but then we'll also touch on the social and environmental benefits and concerns with the district-specific utilities. So there's three of them we looked at. We did actually take a look at, we talked about district stormwater before, but we're not really looking at that in the utility, from a utility perspective, so that's been left out of this specific report. That'll be folded into the discussion on the utility master plan, so that will come back, but not as part of this discussion today. District non-potable water. That is the idea that we essentially expand our existing raw water service that we have currently to PSE at the Incogen site. This is useful and relatively simple because you have an existing rate structure. You already have a first tenant. The idea would just be to expand that for non-potable water uses. District energy is basically a centralized heating system, can also include cooling, and that is a central plant that feeds all your developed areas. District hydro isn't really a utility system per se. It's more of the opportunity to generate hydro power with the existing raw water asset that's down there, and that can be done in conjunction with the non-potable water. The district hydro has limitations on it based on the availability of water, and we've kept our assessment to yearly runoff within the Lake Whatcom watershed. So the first thing, just to touch on the data, you're not supposed to be able to read these graphs. The idea here is to present the bookends, how we took a look at the modeling and to determine whether or not the district utilities would pencil and how fast. What you can do is circle the top left graph. So that's the high-density aggressive growth model, which is it's definitely the most optimistic in regards to your payback will become is the best when you look at high-density aggressive growth, but it's also what we feel is the best choice. It's a density that's what was recognized in the EIS as far as eventually what your build-out is, and the high-density nature, that's what we would like to see down there, and we have every reason to believe that that's probably the most likely. So that's our focus target. The modest growth shows the same amount of density, but basically taking a much longer time, and there's a differential of about 20 years there. The graphs are basically meant to show your cumulative developed square footage on the site. The other two models that you'll see in the report are low density, which is At the end, instead of having 5-story buildings, they're all 4, I mean, roughly speaking, lower fire ratios. And under both growth scenarios, it happens fast or it takes a little bit more time. So the data you'll be presented with in hard copy will be covering all these, but we've looked at the high-density aggressive growth when taking a look at what the payback is for these district-specific systems. And then another key thing that you'll find in the formal hard copy report is we took the land use distribution that we looked at in the EIS as our initial bookend, but it's worth noting that we did, in order to really get a good feel for what type of electricity and heating draws and water draws were going to be down there, we took the extra step to really break it down to give us some detail on what kind of square footages are going to be and what those uses are going to be. So you see, it's worth pointing out that 18% blue part of the right pie chart, that's a Western. Let's say Western comes down. We know that there's discussion about that. So we've taken that step to try to get some detail in there. And so this is also helps you wrap your brain around
Mr. Anthony, can I interrupt you? What's your planning area? You're referring to the downtown waterfront and the shipping terminal areas only?
No, I can back right up. In the scoping work that we presented to council in January, we said the study is going to look at specifically the downtown waterfront only. So this is developed, the downtown type development, because we really don't know what's going to happen at the log pond or in the shipping terminal. We will be providing in the utility master plan connections to serve those areas in the future that are capable of handling a number of different types of land use. But to see that these pencil, we only assumed development within the downtown waterfront, because you really don't know what the land use is going to be elsewhere. So here's your development types, and I just want to kind of point this out. This is the data that will be available to you. You can spend many a rainy spring evening going through the hard copy. There's a lot of good stuff there actually about what might be down there. So we'll talk about the district systems and what the screening said to us. So district non-potable water, there's a couple different options. We looked at 4 different options, and those are shown on the next page. But this is the one that's most likely that has the best payback. And this is, as I mentioned, expanding our existing raw water service down there. You'll see at the bottom of the layout, there's a potential new disinfection facility. So that's just something that we would do to maintain a certain level of water quality, but pretty simplistic. And it's essentially, as I said, a new water system within the district to provide non-potable water use and irrigation. Now, business as usual for this doesn't really exist. Business as usual for this system is irrigating with potable water. So you've already run it through the plant. And so there is no real baseline for business as usual because we don't really do this anywhere else. There's plenty of other purple pipe systems in Washington, which is reclaimed water. It's cheaper. And the idea is that you're avoiding capital costs up at your water treatment plant because you don't have to run it through all the filters and everything. And so there's no real BAU to compare it to this. We also took a look at 4 different ways that we could meet a non-potable water service down at the site. So option 1 was what I just showed you, and that was a raw water feed from Lake Whatcom with a little disinfection. The other 3 items we looked at is what if you did try to do rainwater harvesting or gray water reuse or wastewater reuse, just to give us some perspective. And as you can see, a lot of energy required for not a whole lot of water savings necessarily with wastewater reduction or with wastewater reuse. Gray water starts to look a little bit better. The rainwater, the payback was longer on that because you don't actually generate enough rainwater on a yearly basis down there. And there's a lot of developer kind of input on the rainwater harvesting as well. So when we take a look at these 4 options, the payback does become pretty clear that this is not rocket science for Public Works. We've done this type of thing before. We know how to manage these types of systems. So that comes out as a pretty good looking opportunity for a district system that has a good payback and that will certainly save us some efficiencies on other parts of our water system and utilizes this public asset that we have.
These costs are associated just with the bones that you're laying out here, not any of the side lateral issues.
These are focused. These are focused. Well, these are focused on the full site as we know it today. So this is not only your granary blowdown core, but it also meets, that gets out there. And understanding that there's still the discussion to be had with the the developer or whoever's doing that down there on how the utilities are paid for the side roads. So the idea is you either put your capital, we either do the capital efforts or it goes to the developer and there's a rate structure and that type of thing, and we eventually take those over. But this is figuring the full deal now, which is conservative, because if you only put it down granary blowdown, the capital costs are definitely less.
You have a quick question, Michael?
Yeah, I was wondering if the non-potable water includes fire service. Fire service is huge pipes that are almost never used.
An excellent question. And the potable water system is what's being proposed for fire. So this does not include fire. Probably the big thing is that you have the reservoir is your storage for the raw water system. But that's really it. And that's not something that we have as much control over. And to assure fire flow, we took a hard look at it and just said, it's not worth the risk. The sizing of the pipes, it's not a huge deal to accommodate fire flow necessarily. For this type of development, if you were off in the middle at the end of the line, it might be a different story. And I can see what you're saying, but for this thing, we said we're going to keep the fire flow on the potable system because we can assure that water supply is there because of our system of tanks. So it was a risk thing, but it's a very good question. One of the things I've commented on before is that the raw water, I think, will really help with the inclusion of rainwater systems in the private development because the raw water allows you to not have to have a cistern to cover you for the full summer because you can supplement your rainwater storage if you were doing that with the private development with the raw water system. So I think there's some benefits there as well. Yeah, so at the end of the day, this looks it looks very favorable, and the intent is to let council take a look at the numbers and have input. Staff will be looking, and I'll talk about this when we get to the end here. But we want to hear whatever questions you have about these systems and the data and what's driving the paybacks that we've calculated. We don't know of any grant funding specifically related towards non-potable systems like this. There may be out there. We're not aware of them now. We'll keep looking. But again, that's the opportunity even to buy these systems down a little bit more on the front end. And so we'll keep looking for those. And if you hear of any, please let us know. So a TBL review of district non-potable, again, we wanted to break this out and say, okay, well, we've done the economics. We see the payback period. What else is a factor? And I don't know that I'm really going to go through all these. This is just to show you what we've identified through our consideration of the systems and our knowledge of how they've been applied in other communities. But there's a lot to this. I think again, you have some educational opportunity. There's been a recognized marketing differentiation as far as, hey, we're providing district-specific utilities in this unique environment, in the Northwest. So maybe that would help us, attract businesses and that type of thing, providing these efficient solutions. So there's a lot of stuff there, and again, we welcome your input and thoughts on those. So district energy, here's your sort of baseline. So the business as usual for district energy is basically having all your heating and cooling in a building. They did do number crunching on on what it would be if you just did your standard business as usual. And it's important to think that it is not necessarily code minimum. The city of Bellingham, and even in our sub-area plan, required certain efficiencies in the development down there. So to say that that district energy is that much better than business as usual, we got to remember that in our sub-area plan, we required certain efficiencies already. So, kudos to us, but it doesn't make it look quite as wonderful necessarily when you stack those up. If you did energy, heating and cooling, specifically with building systems, the payback is about 9 years. And that's pretty typical of a developed system. And that's not bad. There's, not the capital costs in the front end are manageable, and you have O&M costs, but there is a pretty quick payback. So you have to compare that to these systems here, and I'll skip right to it. These are different options on getting in district energy. And we can kind of flip back and forth if you want, but I want to compare that 9 years to what you've got here, which are a number of different opportunities to reclaim heat, potentially use biomass, CHP, which is combined heat and power, that all have a number of different scenarios on how we might install a centralized utility plant. And I'll hop right back here so you can take a look at that. See a centralized plant in the lower left? Yeah, the CUP, yep. And so this is the most likely scenario. The cooling could go either way. This is not an environment up here that needs a lot of cooling, so we may find it simpler just to do heating. But we've shown it in both ways as far as with and without cooling. And then if you look at the options here, you'll see right off the bat, options 1 and 1A, that's just heating. It's heating in 1A and heating and cooling, but that's just gas-fired boilers. And that's not too bad as far as your payback, bit of capital. As you move into 2 and 2A, you begin to do heat recovery off of in cogen. That includes thermal storage, and we have looked at the bleach tanks to serve as thermal storage, and they do actually look favorable right now. Structural reinforcement aside, they're approximately the right similar volumes that what you'd want to do is you're drawing that excess heat off in cogen when it runs, storing it in the bleach tanks, and then metering it back into the heating system for whatever development is there. Option 3 and 3A is using the gas boilers, also looking at biomass. Biomass has been used in this part of the region because of all the trees, but it's also, biomass has had certain supply chain issues, so there's a little uncertainty there. We'd want to look at that a little closer. I mean, the nice thing with the gas-fired boilers is you have a big gas line right in Cornwall already, and it's, for the time being, fairly cheap. And then the last one includes a combined heat and power. So that's almost like a mini in cogen plant because you're generating power and excess heat at the same time. So those look, those look good. And at this point, really, we can say it's really it's time to look at the delivery systems. Do we do this on our own? Do we go out and go to the private market or do a P3 partnership? And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But what we really wanted to do is present these different scenarios and answer the questions that council had about any of this stuff. And you'll have your time to chew through the hard copies. Any immediate questions on this right now?
Michael?
Those 8 scenarios up there, they also have a carbon number.
We can pull that out. We don't have it presented here today, but we did look at the emissions reduction, and it's a function of the efficiencies. So we can relate that. That's not a problem. That's a good observation.
So I guess if you have to decide, cost more, greater benefit, not just payback, but if one costs about the same, but it's got 20% more carbon impact.
For comparison, the business as usual, the carbon footprint is about, 15, basically it's about twice what you see up there. Most of those carbons are somewhere between, 8,900 trillion ton, or 8,900 tons of carbon per year, about 15,000 for your business as usual. So that's part of your TBL. So the costs, the payback's longer, but you do have that. And again, you'll see that in more detail in the report.
Jack?
So under this study, did you contemplate tying into the sewer line main?
We haven't looked at that at all. A preliminary look at that is a whole bunch of capital for some heat recovery, but not the type of thing that you would have as your sole source. Ultimately, when you look at the development that we could see down there, that's a lot of heat. And those things, pulling the heat off the sewer might get you a little way there, but it's basically look to be a small percentage.
Preheat.
Yeah, and there's a lot of capital. Now, the big thing, if we ever need to replace that main, I think that would be part of your, so you put in a district heating system, you've got to have a capital plan for that over the years. And so one part of your capital plan could be, we're going to replace the sewer main. As part of that, we could install a heat recovery system, or maybe an upgrade at Oak Street, but more likely probably that sewer main. And that would be part of your overall capital plan for the district heat system. Mm-hmm. So you might look at that in the future. the driver of that's going to be when that sewer main needs to be replaced. Because then you've got sewer dollars that are essentially going to pay for it. And that's why then it begins to work into your revenue stream. It's not a big capital project specifically to the district energy system. Geothermal might pop in there. That's something that we took a look at as well, because that's free heat basically. But when you take a look at the Encogen, the fact that it's already there, immediately that's your first go-to for an additional heat source to help your numbers. So, and if you look at the payback, when you have under 2 and 2A, 2A looks good. I mean, that's probably popping up as the best option in these. So.
Michael?
You briefly mentioned geothermal, which my understanding is you basically drive down into the ground loops that then circulate and take up and exchange heat. Given this is the ground here is maybe a consideration.
Who knows?
It's fill mostly, but is it also toxic fill? I know in other areas it is, but in this area, geothermal may or may not be possible just because of what's down there other than heat and dirt.
That's not something that we looked at. We just said we got to look at this as if it was geothermal, as anywhere. So it's a valid question, and it's really, if you looked at that, if you were beginning to develop that same capital plan, then you would say, all right, well, this is good. You got to figure a little bit more in the budgeting for geothermal because of your existing conditions. So that's how you would include that consideration. But that's not set here necessarily. All right, so TBL, again, I encourage council to look over this and provide feedback. These are the key parts that weigh into the discussion. So sure, maybe your business as usual building is a 9-year payback, and it's 11 years with district energy, but there's a lot of other things going on here. Carbon per year, you've got the efficiencies, definitely have the educational opportunities, that same marketing differentiation. Am I saying that right? Differentiation. Yes, differentiation. Thank you. That definitely pops up here because you have a campus-style system, and it's one less thing for a developer to have to worry about is because if they know they can just hook up to heat. So the last district-specific utility, and again, it's not really so much a district-specific utility because you don't see any lines going through the streets for this one. It's really just what's it look like to generate power down there. And there's a lot that goes into this. As you know, we have an existing city feasibility study. This right here, this system is, we looked at that. We looked at also generation at the granary site and a couple other options, and I'll walk through those here. But the long and short of it is, right now, there's a fairly long payback on generating power about it right now. And the real big reason for that is that we have limited water as far as availability within the watershed. And there's definitely bigger discussions elsewhere in regards to the diversion and how that plays into management of the lake. But for the time being, it doesn't look super hot with only the water that we're available per year, and because it really limits you to 4 to 6 months at the most when you can divert and make power. There's a lot of capital costs that go into a hydro system. The big one, as far as the granary is concerned, is getting that 4-foot pipe underneath the railroad and over to the granary. I mean, that's a chore. There are some existing pipes, but they're only about 24 inches, so that really cuts down on your ability to generate power and subsequently your revenue stream. Options 1, 2, and 3, we basically took a quick look at what the existing pipes might do for us if we put a turbine in, like the Encogen plant feed, really simple, small stuff. And the real issue was that your revenues were really small compared to those upfront costs. So the Encogen supply, that was one. When you're doing district energy heat, trying to draw off some of the head to create power to run the pumps, that was option 2. And then option 1 was if you ran everything that you're going to do for your non-potable system through a turbine, could you make a little extra power? And so none of those paybacks were all, I think, over 130 years or something. So it really didn't make a lot of sense. So options 4, 5, and 6 are the options of putting it either at the city, where the city reviewed the potential district hydro station, which down at the end of Bay Street there, or along Bay Street, in that zone. Option 5 was granary, and then option 6 was if we put it over in our central utility plant. And so, as you can see, granary looks the best because that had the costs there were a little bit less in the grand scheme of things. We didn't quite get what we wanted out of because of the cost for the city site. You have to have both a tail race, and you have to have additional piping that you wouldn't necessarily have to have if you just ran the 24 under the tracks and made it at granary, because then you just charge right there. So a couple of subtle differences between those two, and then putting it over at the central utility plant site. That's really just a capital cost thing there, because you've got to move that much more pipe to get it over to that location. So these represent an awesome idea, but one that has to have bigger discussions at a higher level, and you're all aware of that. And we also recognize that this is the type of, this is if we were to deliver it in the city. We think that we know that there's interest in the private sector, and we think that the private sector has certainly brings something to bear in this market that we might not be able to, in a go-it-alone situation. So there's definitely, further discussion on this, but this is where we are right now.
Michael?
These costs, $5, $6, $7 million seem really high to me for district hydro. Is most of that cost the piping, or is it the actual
Approximately
turbine?
half to say 60% is in the piping. So a couple of years ago, for $2.8 million, we put the secondary outfall at a post point, and that went under railroad tracks, and it was actually a little less piping as far as landside piping. So I think they're in line with what we've seen for a similar type of project, and it's good to know that we as a department have done a similar project, because we can kind of get our heads around it. But and then, say 40% is in the actual installation of the actual turbine unit. Maybe at the granary, again, we have a city study for the city site that has some proposed designs. But it's tricky getting big bore pipe around, and that's a kind of a tight location for sure. So. Okay. I did want to note, actually, I was remiss in not bringing this up here. For District Energy, we did recognize some possible grant funding through the U.S. Department of Energy. There's a combined heat and power and a District Energy grant. So staff will continue to look at those, and if there's a deadline that's sooner rather than later, we'll have a hard look at that. But we do know that there's at the federal level, the U.S. DOE has definitely made funds available for these types of projects. So we'll take a look at those. And then similarly to the district hydro, we are aware that there's a Northwest Clean Air Agency grant that could be made available. So these are the types of things that are not figured into those paybacks, but that's opportunity to basically buy those down on the front end and make those look better.
Jack?
I had kind of a question about the Georgia Pacific operation when it was going. So it took the 48-inch pipe down by Bay Street and then split it into multiple 24-inch lines underneath the tracks?
So you've got a couple that go over towards Granary, and then a couple that go down on the north side of Cornwall. So it's split not too far from the bridge project that we were just discussing with Larry. It's right in that same zone as where the 48 ends. So the 48 doesn't make it all the way down to the elevation that pretty much all the waterfront's on. It stops up at, downtown upfront theater, kind of that elevation. And then, there's a couple of big valves and T's there. And then you got your 24s and 30. I think there's a 30 and 3 24s, or 2 24s and a 16, something of that.
And does that 48-inch line, is that running all on city property?
Yeah, I believe it
underneath?
is all on city, either owned in fee or right of way.
Okay.
Yeah. Getting it under the bridge, we would have to work with, or under BNSF, we'd have to work with them, but we've certainly done that before. Get an easement, it's nothing that we haven't done, and then tee it up into presumably some sort of right of way to be dedicated as part of the binding site plan for the waterfront.
Okay.
So to finish, so again, the TBL, I'll let you guys, you folks can take a look at that. And again, we welcome feedback on this. If there's something we've missed, we'd like to have that, because when we come back to you, we want to take a look at the big picture. So I'll touch real quick on delivery options. City of Bellingham Public Works, so if we go this alone, this is good for similar utilities. We've already seen that the non-potable water, we already have a rate structure and a tenant, so that looks favorable for the type of thing that we can do and run ourselves. Public-private partnership, maybe using the city's position to leverage funds, but working with a private contractor to potentially operate and maintain like a hydro facility or something like that, or the district energy. Those begin to look pretty good as far as keeping the efficiencies that the private sector offers. There's a number of district energy systems in Portland that are run by either Corix or ABM, basically private companies that do a very efficient job running this type of thing and can take risks away from the city in the long term of do we run heat exchangers, which we don't normally fix every day. And so that looks pretty, that's an opportunity for something maybe like district energy where we're a little less familiar with it. And then do a full-on request for proposals for something where we just don't have the time or wherewithal to really get into it. Or for instance, like the power market, something that we just don't normally do, to just go out there and see what that interest is in the private sector. If there's people that are like, hey, I can do this, and I bring these, these efforts to bear. So this is something definitely to think of, and the idea is that staff will come back in probably late June or July with our final recommendations. Over the next month, we're going to make this our report available to the port, and via the port, the developer will get whatever feedback they have on what we're thinking and what we're seeing. Input, is key from all parties to really bring that back so we can make some final recommendations to council, and then council can advise us what to basically put into that utility master plan, and we'll be hitting into that. The utility master plan is essentially it'll lay out the utilities and then also contribute to the actual utility design that's in Granary Blodell, which is right now envisioned to be the spine for both traditional utilities and whatever district stuff we do. With that, I'll certainly take any questions, and we welcome any type of feedback. Send it to Ted, he'll send it to me. Questions about whatever you see here or stuff that when you dig into the report. We'll make the report available to Mark Gardner, and then he can sort of distribute it as you guys see fit. And by the end of May, anything you could possibly ask, and we'll try to get a good discussion going. And with that, any other questions?
Yeah, this isn't a question on this, but just a comment. In the future, it would be really helpful for the committee if, when we're having this kind of presentations, this was a good presentation, that we get these with the packets so that we have a chance to look at them beforehand. So, it's much easier formulating the questions when you have some idea of the presentation. And I know that it was something in past councils we had requested. And I know sometimes it's hard to do, but if we're gearing to do that, if that's the deadline, then, so that's what I would really request in the future, that we have those. Because it does, we're taking in a lot of information, and this is really good information, but it's so much more helpful if we have a chance to look through some of this, and then we can concentrate on what you're saying and not the other part.
Well, not to speak for Ted, but there may be an opportunity to come back to a committee as a whole in early June, once the detailed report, the real numbers have been.
Well, that I would really hope that you do when we get the full report, so we have a chance to look at it.
Yeah, just briefly on the presentations. I mean, it's always been an issue. We look at it both ways. Typically, the PowerPoints don't have enough detail in them. This did have a lot of detail in them, but I've certainly been in situations where it's caused a lot more challenges than if you didn't have it before, because a couple bullet points can lead conversations down the wrong road if they're not given in consultation with a presentation that fills in the blanks. So, they're not reports, they're a presentation aid. I hear what you're saying, but I've certainly seen it where it's problematic when we give the presentations out before, and I spend the weekend trying to answer questions that came out of a bullet point that really didn't need to cause any alarm because they were just
But the question shouldn't need to come from the committee beforehand. It should come out of the committees after we've got a chance to hear it, just so we don't have to.
Yeah, no, and our intent was to give this presentation and then give plenty of time for questions. We can come back again. You can send the questions to me. We can give another presentation, but I don't know. I'm always hesitant to give out the PowerPoints alone without the detail, because the PowerPoint is a presentation aid. It's not a report, but we can certainly have that discussion.
I find it helpful. Michael?
I have two questions. One's hopefully small, and then another one's a little bit broader. On that one graph where you showed the four scenarios,
Sure, yep.
those bars showing cumulative development, they change color halfway through. What did that mean?
I will tell you. So that's the different blues are the different phases. So we did identify 5 essentially phases of infrastructure in the sub-area plan. So those coincide with those first phases. So if you want to go ahead and say, well, what do we think the development's going to be when commercial, that milestone is met, then that allows you to kind of chop it up into chunks of development. So
So the color change is the big end of phase 3 Commercial Street
Sure.
Bridge.
yeah, and it's in the EIS, the way we envision the infrastructure being laid out. So you can take a look at that. Planning has done some really good work with hypothetical phasing of development as well, starting around the granary and moving south. And so, by using that, we were able to actually pin square footages per year. Oh, we might do this block. And it's all very, it's our best guess. So,
My next question has to do with the concept of eco-district for the waterfront. It was one of the ideas that was talked about during waterfront planning. It was never quite clear if we were really doing an eco-district or being eco-district-like. I know that city staff, went to a conference and received training on that idea, 2 years ago during the waterfront planning phase. How does these district utility planning, going beyond business as usual, how much does that tie into the idea of eco-district?
Well, I think it's very much in line with the concept of eco-district, which is really looking at a whole broad array of things within a given area. And when we went through the waterfront planning process, the development regulations, for instance, many of those that were more progressive than perhaps zoning or requirements in other parts of the city were in line with an eco-district. So it can be anything. It can be your building codes. It can be how your utilities are delivered. It could be recycling options that are available. It's a whole array of things. The concept of eco-district is really a branding that, and Tara, I think, is still in the audience. She might be able to speak to it better than I can, but eco-district is a brand to try to I guess, best describe and bring all of those concepts together in a given area where the development practices and building practices are more sustainable. This is very much in line with it. District level utilities fits right in with that concept of trying to be more efficient, reduce emissions, all of the things that eco-districts are all about.
Jack, you had a question?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on Terry's comment and yours, Ted, about the what?
I'm envisioning giving this particular PowerPoint out without Fritz's details, but I'd like to hear your question.
Well, the comment is just, as a council member, and I want to speak for the committee and other council members, is that, when we get these things on Thursday, the week before, and we're trying to prepare for the meeting, to get something like this in this much detail is kind of hard, and all we have to run off of is just the cover sheet in the agenda packet. And I would think that maybe in a normal situation we'd get, for the amount of detail that you gave to us, Fritz, a 5, 6, 7 page report that would be part of this, that would give a lot of the details outside of the bullet points that are in the slideshow. But I don't think that, I really don't think that that's appropriate to go and put that type of effort into a report, because that's going to take you half a day to go and put that together. To me, it seemed like just providing this. I try not to go and contact you over the weekend if I see a bullet point that's out. I would save that question until the committee meeting.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't have a problem, obviously, with folks contacting me. I would prefer, and I certainly understand what the committee is saying, putting together a staff report. And so that we can, so when you read it, all those questions that may come up when you look at a PowerPoint presentation, which is very incomplete, if you had a memo or a staff report, executive summary, you could get that information. So maybe that's the model that we need to go to, is if we're coming for an informational update, we provide in the packet a staff memo or a executive summary. I would certainly prefer that to the PowerPoint, but I hear what you're saying is you want information before the presentation so you can be more prepared. I think that the PowerPoint, the very nature of a PowerPoint, that would be very counterproductive, but I'm hearing that's not what the council feels.
Michael?
I want to move away from that, but I do agree. We like to be prepared in some way. My question has to do with what was left out of this, which is stormwater. Stormwater was not part of these investigations. One of the other things that the council expressed interest in has to do with shoreline rehabilitation, and one of the largest possible negative impacts in the shorelines is stormwater. So it's not part of this, but when we move forward on the discussion on shoreline improvements, will stormwater be part of that discussion?
Yeah, and I'll turn it over to Freeman, but stormwater has certainly been considered in this analysis and will be part of the utility master plan. One of the things that's unique about this, well, not unique, I mean, because it's draining to the bay, detention or stormwater control, flow control is not an issue. What we really are talking about is water quality. So the notion of a regionalized stormwater facility is I think, not as pertinent, but I'll turn it over to Freeman and he can maybe expand on what they've looked at as it relates to stormwater.
Yeah, and Ted touched on probably the number one thing, which is you're immediately adjacent to Puget Sound, so you don't have stormwater flow controls, which is the number one driver as far as when you see large facilities. And so in this particular case, we have taken a look at the draft EIS, contemplated where stormwater would be in the developed situation. It certainly thought, okay, we're probably going to need some new outfalls. We started with that historic work that had been done. And as we crank through the numbers, you kind of have two options. You could centralize everything, but then you'll wind up with two sets of stormwater systems, one for polluted water and one for clean water, and that's double your capital right there. And what made sense, which is in line with eco-district thinking, was point source, i.e. some sort of bioretention block by block, rather than just collecting it all in catch basins and going to a large facility. So I think that supports the eco-district concepts, doing it block by block. We're getting a lot of that experience now from both projects we did last year, Cornwall Maple, the CBD Rain Garden project. We're just moving in that direction. And the stormwater district utility study basically said, yeah, that's the way to go, is block by block, and then your piped system is essentially all treated stormwater. And where that discharges, that's going to be a bit of discussion. You could discharge into natural systems, and that's certainly an option. We haven't really quite got that far yet, because there's other land use stuff that will drive that. And at the end of the day, if somebody says, hey, we're going to do habitat over here, I'll just make sure the pipe gets over there, because that's where it's best used.
If we're going to move towards source control as our stormwater strategy in the waterfront, will we need to be making any changes to the development code, or so when private development goes in, they know they're going to be doing, source control? Do we need to change to implement this district-wide utility plan for stormwater? Do we need to amend the development regulations or requirements anyway?
Pardon me. No, I think they're very much in line with that model. And as we've worked with the port throughout the planning process, the concept was always that the private development would need to control stormwater on private development. We would provide some type of conveyance and ultimately outfall into the bay in the arterials or the intersecting streets. I think what Freeman's point was a good one, is that the source control on private property, but that we look at a different way to provide that conveyance through something that's a little bit more sustainable with water quality, rather than just big facilities with design engineered canister or something like that. But But I think the development regs certainly support controlling it on private property through LID. You know, we have challenges with this, with the ability to infiltrate given the site, but there's other alternatives that they can do down there.
And they will be held to the 2012 Stormwater Manual, which is going to be
Right.
applied to both us and the private development. So, you know, in the grand scheme of things, the private developer, you know, development will likely, I mean, the only real pollution generating impervious surfaces are parking. And so that's going to be the one thing where we would look as far as approval of those types of projects, making sure that what goes into our stormwater system has been treated on, you know, on the private sites, and thus we don't need to do those centralized systems to support that.
Jack?
I'm assuming that all of the lines that you were showing on the maps were all going to be enclosed in utilidors?
The utilidor is a good question. You know, we're going to take a look at that. There's a lot of things that will go into that. We'll talk to PSE, Cascade Natural Gas, and say, what do you guys think about utilidors? It'll be part of looking at the actual costs for district energy, whether or not it's heating or heating and cooling. So we'll take a look at that as sort of part of our standard repertoire of looking at this. There is an opportunity to definitely do that, at least on the granary Blodell spine. But there's stuff that, you know, there's some technical details that'll have to be figured out before we say, yes, we're going to do a utilidor. Crossings, existing site grades, there's a host of things to take a look at. So we'd love to do that, but I think we need to, we're still at that higher level where, what are we going to do? And then we'll figure out where to put it and how to support it in the subgrade.
Okay. And then I think I know the answer to this, but I want to ask it just to make sure that what you've done in this study is just based on the master plan that was approved in December with the, well, I mean, what we ended up approving was just the primary streets, the arterials in the plan. But I'm noticing in this, in the maps that you were showing all of these side blocks. And it's, I don't know, it was a comment that I made last fall, which was that those side blocks are, you know, the way that the orientation of those streets were set up in a way that it did not present any sort of grid pattern. It really was, you know, some of them were going this way, some were going that way, and it didn't make any rhyme or reason for traffic flow purposes that, you know, how that would be. So I'm assuming that the master developer would end up changing that around, and this study would then be modified to adjust to that?
I don't think it needs to, it really probably doesn't need to be modified too much unless you saw a really big change in the street grid. The idea was we needed some sort of linear footage of pipes to put in the ground to begin to develop those capital costs. So, you know, we have a lot of streets, and you'll see there's a lot of linear foot of pipe that's in those capital costs. So pretty conservative. Unless there was a real big change, I think this study still is stout and gives us a good feeling for where we're going to be as payback when we make the decisions on what to do.
Okay. And the final comment is just looking at the hydro project itself and realizing that, you know, the water is only going to be available for part of the year, and those months that it's going to be part of is typically going to be in the winter. And I don't know, I'm just thinking like the tissue warehouse, and there's 5 acres of rooftop there for photovoltaic opportunities, that where the peak on that would be during the times when you wouldn't have availability of water. You'd almost have like a balanced system by having a good, you know, photovoltaic system combined with the microhydro.
That's, I mean, really, solar is just, it could be another part of if you expanded your district energy approach. And I know that, you know, the council has working groups on community energy in general, and that's really where I would start. You know, if you recognized some sort of funding program or some sort of initiative for solar, you would apply it there, but just like you might in any other existing city facility. But it's certainly something that's good to keep on the radar and could balance that out. I would definitely love to throw that at the, you know, see what the developers thought about that too.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, well,
Okay.
thank you very much for the report,
Appreciate
and I
it.
look
And
forward to the full report.
We definitely welcome feedback, and if there's discussion to come back and talk about it again, I think that's certainly warranted, you know, in June or so, before we bring final recommendations.
So that ends our committee, and the next committee planning will start at 10:30. We are now adjourned.